Hello everyone, thank you for being virtually here today. This is the voice of Simone Bettega. I'm sorry you will probably hear a slight background noise. I wasn't quite able to get rid of it, but I think you should be able to hear me alright all the same. So my presentation today is about the historical evolution of syntactic agreement in spoken Arabic. As some of you may know, in the last couple of years I have worked quite extensively on the topic of agreement, often together with my friend and colleague Luca Danna, and we have tried to provide a synchronic description as accurate as possible of agreement patterns in different varieties of Arabic. One point that remains to address, however, is how the present situation came to be. What linguistic and extra-linguistic forces shaped the gender and agreement system of modern dialects precisely in this way as we see them today? And in short, what can agreement tell us about the history of Arabic languages? Now, in order to answer these questions, let us start with a rapid overview of what it is that we know about agreement in Arabic. The contents of the next slide I have already presented in other talks, in other conferences, so to some of you this might come as a repetition. But the good thing about pre-recorded presentations is that if it is the case, you can just skip this part and jump to the next slide. So, if we look at the morphological markers that are used to express gender, we can divide all varieties of Arabic, and this includes written varieties, into two groups. The first group includes all varieties that have retained feminine plural forms of the adjective, verb, and pronoun. Some of these show this distinction on other parts of speech as well, for instance demonstratives, and in some cases even genitive markers. But this applies only to a subgroup of these varieties, so for the sake of the present discussion I will only focus on these three categories, adjectives, verbs, and pronouns. The second group of varieties, on the contrary, has lost the distinction between masculine and feminine in the plural, so that now a single form exists that is historically derived from the plural masculine and that is now used as a common plural forms in adjectives, verbs, and pronoun. Now, all of these we can say on the basis of morphology alone. If we look at syntax, that is, if we look at agreement, we see that the second group of dialects, so I'm starting from the bottom part of the slide here, we see that the second group of dialects present relatively straightforward agreement patterns. Singular nouns attract either masculine singular or feminine singular agreement, and all plural nouns attract common plural agreement, irrespective of their gender in the singular. So you can see that in these dialects, all nouns can be divided into two groups, that is, two genders, on the basis of the type of agreement they attract in the singular. When we look at varieties that retain gender distinction in the plural, we see that things are a little more complicated. In these varieties, singular nouns behave in the same way as in the other group. So they take either masculine singular or feminine singular agreement. Plural agreement, however, is different in that it is only nouns that refer to biologically masculine human beings that can attract masculine plural agreement. All other nouns take feminine plural agreement. This obviously entails that many nouns that take masculine agreement in the singular take feminine plural agreement when plural. So here we have a system that is different from the one that we have seen for the other group of dialects, because in this case nouns can be divided into three groups or three genders, or to use a more exact terminology, three agreement classes. The first of these agreement classes takes masculine, the noun that belongs to the first agreement class take masculine singular agreement when singular, masculine plural agreement when plural. The second group takes feminine singular agreement when singular and feminine plural agreement when plural, but the third group takes masculine singular agreement when singular, but feminine plural agreement when plural. Obviously, in this slide, I have made no mention of feminine singular agreement with plural nouns. That is almost always an option in virtually all dialects, but I will return on this point later. And it exists in alternation with the agreement options that we have just seen. This means that virtually any plural noun can take feminine singular agreement under the right circumstances. It has to be noted that feminine singular agreement is extremely common with certain classes of nouns and extremely rare with others. Feminine singular agreement normally indicates that the referent is not individuated, it's not specific, it is referred to in a very generic sense, so it's more common with inanimate and abstract nouns and of course with collectives, and it is rarely used in relation with human and non-collective nouns, and particularly non-collective human nouns. What is important is that feminine singular agreement does not represent an agreement class on its own, but rather it is an alternative agreement type that cuts across the agreement classes that we have just described. It is available for all of them. Now, in the last months, I have consulted every description I could get access to of dialects that retain feminine plural morphology. I did a very extensive survey. I believe I left very little out, and the results of this survey are strikingly uniform. The agreement system I have just described, the one with 3 agreement classes, seems to be a feature of all these dialects. There is no exception. If a dialect has feminine plural forms in verbs and pronouns, then its agreement system works as we have just seen. This is true of the dialects of the Maghreb, the few that still retain feminine plural forms. This is true of sub-Saharan Africa, dialects of the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, Egypt, Iraq, and even Central Asian dialects from Iran to Uzbekistan. So this is the first point I would like to make. It has sometimes been suggested that it is peculiar that these specific agreement pattern, feminine plural agreement with non-human nouns, is an innovation of certain dialects. It is not. I have reported this quote from Blanc, you have it here, where it calls this pattern a generalization of some dialect, which implies that these dialects, at least some of them, started out with a different agreement system but then overextended the use of feminine plural agreement. Now, first of all, it is not some dialects, it's actually all of them. And then this is no generalization at all. As a matter of fact, this same agreement system is found in the earliest attestation of Arabic that have been passed down to us. You find almost exactly the same system in pre-Islamic poetry and in the Quran itself, and you even find it in some Safavidic inscriptions. This quote that I have inserted here is taken from Al-Jallad and Yaworka's dictionary of Safavidic. And you can see that the verb, however vocalized, the verb tarada, is referred to horses, and it is feminine plural. Now, I don't want to enter the debate here about whether or not Safavidic is to be considered Arabic. I agree with Ahmed Al-Jallad on this point, that this is mostly a matter of terminology. If this is not yet or not fully Arabic, then it is something very, very closely related to it. And I think this at least proves that these agreement patterns are very, very old. So, as you can see, this agreement system is attested almost everywhere across space-time. The only exception to this rule, the only variety that has retained feminine plural forms but does not show these patterns, is modern standard Arabic, with its prescriptive rule of feminine singular agreement with all non-human plural controllers. In this respect, modern standard Arabic is highly innovative and deviant with respect to what has historically been the development of agreement and gendered system in Arabic. I will not develop on this subject further, though I have no time here. My colleague Luca Danna has explored the topic in depth. You might have been lucky enough to attend one of his very interesting talks in other conferences, I'm afraid. If you haven't, don't worry. We're working together on a book on the subject. It will come out soon, so after that you will know everything that you want to know about how and why modern standard Arabic evolved the way it did. At present, we are concerned with how the agreement system of the modern dialects evolved. So let's delve deep in this mystery. I think it is uncontroversial to say that all modern dialects of Arabic that lack feminine plural morphology have evolved at a certain point in time from a variety that once had that distinction. It is unlikely that this process happened just once in the course of history. Actually, we have evidence of the contrary. In other words, lack of feminine plural morphology is polygenetic in Arabic dialects. I will return on this point later. Now, I would like to make my second point. That is, if we accept the previous statement as true, then one might rightly ask, okay, these dialects without distinction came from dialects that had that distinction, but what did their original agreement system look like? Well, based on the evidence I have just discussed on the fact that the system with the 3 agreement classes is found literally all over the Arabic-speaking world, from Tunisia to Uzbekistan, and dates back to the oldest known attestation of Arabic that we know of, then I think it is safe to say that that system was the original one. There is no historical attestation, no evidence from any modern dialect of a variety of Arabic that possessed feminine or possessed feminine plural morphology, and whose agreement system works in a way that is different from the one I have described at the beginning of this presentation. My point then is that all varieties of Arabic started out with a tripartite agreement system where masculine plural morphology was exclusively reserved for human male subjects, while feminine plural morphology served all other types of plural. Then some varieties retained this system up to this day, while other varieties evolved, losing feminine plural morphology and undergoing a radical rearrangement of their agreement system. But here comes the real question. How did these dialects move from system 1 to system 2? What caused this transition, and was the rearrangement of the agreement system the cause or the consequence of the loss of feminine plural morphology? Now, some authors writing about the loss of feminine plural morphology in Arabic dialects have used the term morphological erosion. Hanich, for instance, is one of these authors. In her paper, she speaks of morphological. You can see it here. Now, I have nothing against the use of this terminology as long as we clearly define what we mean by it. If we take morphological erosion to mean the result of a series of regular phonetic changes that, in the end, brought about the disappearance of a whole class of phonemes, of morphemes, then I don't think I can share this view. Similar explanations have been put forward to explain the loss of other morphological classes in Arabic dialects, most notably case and mood endings. Obviously, this is very highly hypothetical, but I don't want to discuss this here. So I'm just saying that maybe something similar could be proposed for the loss of feminine plural morphology. To the best of my knowledge, this has never been done in relation to feminine plural morphology, but maybe it could be attempted. Maybe something along the lines of loss of final nouns, final n's, followed by loss of final short vowels. We have no time to discuss the actual details of the possible hypotheses here, but in general, I think there are several obstacles to these hypotheses. I believe that it could maybe work to explain the absence of feminine plural morphology in the verb and pronoun in some dialects, and then you'd have to explain the absence of this morphology in adjectives as the result of paradigmatic pressure, but it wouldn't work for other dialects. You would have to explain a lot of exceptions. So again, this is problematic. Also, there is a second very strong objection to this hypothesis, and I will come to this in a minute. Keep this in mind. I'll be back to this in a moment. Before, I just want to say that in opposition to the idea of regular phonetic changes, I maintain that the explanation of this phenomenon, loss of feminine plural morphology, is to be looked for in the process of urbanization, understood as an ecological factor capable of affecting linguistic structure. Obviously, this idea is not new, and neither is it a particularly brilliant observation. Anyone who looks at a map of the Arabic-speaking world immediately realizes that dialects that have lost feminine plural morphology tend to cluster around large urban centers, while those that retain it are mostly located in rural areas. This is really systematic, it's really striking. You could count the exceptions to this rule on the fingers on one hand, even if your hand was missing some fingers. However, saying that some type of correlation exists between urbanization and erosion of feminine plural forms is not enough. As I said, the coincidence of the two phenomena is so extensive, is so pervasive, that they are bound to be connected somehow. But what is the nature? What is the exact nature of this connection? An attempt at explaining this connection has been made by Al-Sharkawi in a paper published in 2014. The main thesis of Al-Sharkawi article is that the rearrangement of the gender system in Arabic dialects is a consequence of urbanization. As I said, I completely agree with this position. However, I'm afraid this is one of the only thing I agree with in Al-Sharkawi's article. I have no time to discuss here the pros and cons of his work. There are several elements in it that I find highly problematic, but I will focus on the major one. Al-Sharkawi maintains that the reduction of the morphological options observed in urban Arabic dialects is a consequence of the process of koinization and simplification that took place in the first garrison towns that the Arabs established in the newly conquered territories during the Islamic conquest, of course, from the 7th century onwards. Now, as far as koinization is concerned, I don't see how koinization could be a factor at play. If speakers of different dialects of Arabic started living side by side in these new towns, why should they have leveled out feminine plural forms if all their dialects had feminine plural forms? If they hadn't, well, then all the process of loss of feminine plural forms must have started long before and somewhere else. So we're back to square one. As far as simplification is concerned, that is the conscious process by which an L1 speaker willingly simplifies his language to make it more accessible to the L2 speakers he has to interact with. We can imagine this happened very frequently in the territories that the Muslim troops conquered. Well, to an extent, I may say this stands to reason, and I'm even ready to concede that it might actually have been one of the factors that contributed to the loss of feminine plural morphology, in certain areas of the Arab world at least. However, there is a very strong objection to this explanation as well, and this is the same objection that can be used to confute the hypothesis of phonetic changes, as I anticipated. Remember when I was talking about morphological erosion as a process of phonetic change, I say that there is an obstacle to this hypothesis? Well, here it is. The main obstacle to both these theories is the polygenesis of morphological change in Arabic dialects. There is unconfutable evidence that loss of feminine plural forms in Arabic dialects is a process that occurred over and over again through the course of history, at different moments and in different places. It continues to happen today as we speak. For instance, Ridban Mimoun has shown how in the Bedouin dialects of southern Tunisia one can see an incipient process of loss of feminine plural morphology that is being substituted with masculine plural forms. Obviously, in this case, one could say that it is the influence of the more prestigious dialect of the capital, Tunis, that is having an effect on this dialect. And that would probably be true to an extent. But then, how to explain the fact that between the 18th and the 19th century, certain tribes from the Najd, from Central Arabia, moved to the Gulf Coast, to the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and settled there, and very rapidly their dialect lost feminine plural forms. There were no non-native speakers in the area, and there were no prestigious dialects that could have induced this change. Or think about Baghdad in the 13th century. The city was mostly populated by Keltu speakers, speakers of Keltu dialects. Then the Mongols came, slaughtered a good portion of the inhabitants, and then the city gets later repopulated by an influx of immigrants from the surrounding countryside. Today, Muslim Baghdadi, the Muslim dialects of Baghdad, have no feminine plural morphology, while several Bedouin dialects in Iraq still preserve it. Think of Khartoum in Sudan. Both Reichmuth and Dickens confirm that feminine plural forms are almost completely lost in Khartoum today, and that they are perceived as a rural feature. As a matter of fact, in the description of other non-urban Sudanese dialects, one systematically finds feminine plural forms. It's very frequent in Sudan, outside Khartoum. Khartoum today is a huge metropolis, but it was founded relatively recently, in the early 19th century, and its demographics only exploded in the 20th century. Until not long ago, it looks like its dialect possessed feminine plural forms. So again, they have been lost relatively recently. But then, if none of the hypotheses that we have seen up to this moment is able to explain how it is that many Arabic dialects came to lose plural gender distinction, what is a possible explanation? Well, the idea that languages are directly influenced by the environment in which their speakers live is not new in linguistics. But how exactly has a change in an environment, that is urbanization, caused loss of gender distinction in the plural? Well, by looking at several grammars of Arabic dialects that retain gender distinction in the plural, as I was saying, one can notice that when it comes to agreement, there are a couple of observations that their authors make over and over again. There are a couple of recurring points. The first one concerns female speakers. It appears that female speakers tend to replace feminine plural forms with masculine plural ones when talking about themselves or about groups of other women. In general, in the speech of all speakers, it appears that feminine plural agreement is first lost in connection to human controllers, and only after in reference to non-human ones. This has been confirmed over and over again by many different authors. I have inserted reference here. And this is remarkably counterintuitive. One would expect that the most salient of all controllers, namely human controllers, would be the last one to lose gender distinction. Well, it appears that intuition is misleading in this case. Human controllers are the first to lose the ability to trigger feminine plural agreement. This is perhaps not surprising if one considers that in the case of mixed group, the default agreement is already masculine plural, so that only groups consisting exclusively of women are referred to using feminine plural agreement. And when women talk about themselves, they tend to replace feminine plural forms with masculine plural ones, and in the end this probably gets extended to male speakers. Again, this is unsurprising. Cross-linguistic literature tells us that linguistic innovation is normally originated, or at least it is more frequent, in the speech of women. The question, of course, remains of why this particular change finds its origin in the speech of women. It is perhaps possible that women were not so happy to find themselves in the same agreement category as animals and objects. So in other words, the question here is, are there social-linguistic motivations behind the specific innovation? I think this is an interesting question, but of course one that we will have to explore another time. So from what we have seen so far, it would seem that dialects tend to go through a phase in which masculine plural agreement is reserved for human controllers, all human controllers, while feminine plural agreement becomes restricted or mostly restricted to non-human ones. Now, a second recurring observation in these grammars is that feminine plural agreement is particularly common with animal controllers, and less so with inanimate ones. You can find references to this general trend in virtually every grammar of any variety that retains feminine plural morphology. This is not surprising at all, again, because animals are animate and therefore tend to be perceptibly more salient, while inanimate objects often score low on the individuation scale, so that for them it is more common to trigger feminine singular agreement and not feminine plural agreement. Remember that in all these dialects, feminine singular agreement always remains an agreement option that exists in variation with plural agreement and is normally reserved to non-specific, non-individuated controllers. Now, imagine that speakers of a dialect of this type, who were once possibly nomadic cattle herders, or maybe they were sedentary but lived in very small settlements, find themselves living in progressively larger urban centers. The living conditions of rural and urban populations are remarkably different, in particular when it comes to employment patterns. Cattle rearing is common about rural population, but it's very hard to practice for city dwellers. In particular, innovation brings about a detachment of human beings from the so-called, inverted quotes, natural world. I don't really like the expression, but for want of a better one. To put it very bluntly, there tend to be very few animals inside cities, in particular large domestic animals, cattle, that are the prime targets of feminine plural agreement. If you take them out of the picture, and then you greatly reduce the need to linguistically refer to this type of controllers, then the number of possible contexts for feminine plural agreement to appear are greatly reduced. So this is my third and probably most important point. At a certain point in time, these varieties, at a certain point in time, and this varies from dialect to dialect, but the feminine plural agreement is no longer used to refer to human beings, for the reasons that we have seen. It is no longer used to refer to animals because there is a lack of linguistic context in which animals are still referred to, and it is only rarely used to refer to inanimate objects. Here you have a morphological category that has become so marginal that is now ready to disappear from the language. And this is what I think has happened over and over again to feminine plural forms in Arabic dialects, again and again in different places and through the course of history. So we're almost at the end of the story. I'm running out of time. I have already run out of time. A last question that we could ask ourselves is, and what happens next? What happens when feminine plural forms finally disappear from the language? Now, okay, some of the things I will say on this topic are rather speculative, but still, here I make my fourth and final point. It would seem that most dialects retain the old variation between plural and feminine singular agreement, with the obvious difference that now all plural agreement is common plural agreement. Feminine plural agreement is no longer an option. Obviously, one could ask, okay, well, did the relative percentages of plural and singular agreement remain relatively the same in the language? In other words, do we still encounter feminine singular agreement with the same frequency as before the dialect lost its feminine plural morphology? Or has it become more common? Or has it become less common? Or maybe it is more common in dialects that have lost feminine plural agreement only recently, or conversely, in dialects that have lost it long ago. Well, to be honest, I don't think a universal answer exists to these questions. I'm not even sure an answer is possible at all. It would imply measuring the average frequency of certain type of agreement in a dialect that still has feminine plural forms, compare it to a similar measurement made in a dialect that has lost feminine plural forms, and this would require a huge corpora, because agreement, as we have seen, is extremely context dependent. So in order to measure its actual frequency, you should make sure that you have included every possible text type and in very large quantity. Plus, even if we were able to do that, which we aren't, the problem still remains that a single dialect cannot be considered representative of the whole category. With or without feminine plural morphology, it doesn't matter. And also, we cannot be sure that dialects that still have feminine plural today maintain the same balance between feminine singular and plural agreement as dialects which existed in the past but are now gone. As a matter of fact, the data that we have gathered so far seem to show that a great deal of variation exists from dialect to dialect, which makes this comparative task an almost impossible one. Having said that, we have data about some dialects that stand out from the rest because they show highly divergent patterns. The most notable example is that of Cairo Arabic. Several scholars have reported that feminine singular agreement in this dialect is extremely common. In particular, with non-human controllers, it seems to be almost the default option. There are niches in which plural agreement still goes strong. But I guess we cannot exclude in this case an evolutionary pattern that would in the future eventually lead to a more regular system in which all plural non-human controllers take feminine singular agreement and all plural ones take masculine plural agreement. This system would be similar to what we have today in Modern Standard Arabic, but without plural morphology, so in a way simpler. On the contrary, it is very interesting to note that certain Western dialects in the Maghreb seem to be particularly innovative in that they have abandoned feminine singular agreement completely or almost completely. In these dialects, for instance, urban Moroccan and Maltese, common plural agreement is now the only agreement option for plural controllers, and in this sense their agreement system has become remarkably simpler. Remember that variation is an important factor to consider when measuring the relative complexity of a linguistic system. The number of available morphological options of course is one factor, but the fact that you have two or more forms that exist in conditioned or free variation is another important one. So all agreement systems in Arabic are rather complex because they all feature variation, often a lot of variation, and the only exception are again Modern Standard Arabic with its very rigid rules and certain Maghribi dialects that have expunged variation from their system, making them eventually the simplest agreement systems that we observe throughout the Arabic speaking world. Obviously, the question then arises of why it is that these particular dialects underwent this development. But I'm afraid I totally ran out of time here, and also I don't have an answer to this question, so we will leave it for another time. Here I have just inserted a summary of the 4 points I have made. The 4 points I have made in the course of this presentation, and now we really came to the end of it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. For any question you might have, I'll be happy to answer them in the question in the Q&A session, or you can write me an email at my email address. Here it is, you see it on screen. And also, if you are interested in the bibliographical sources, please do feel free to contact me, and thank you all for listening.